On September 7th of 1982, a 58-foot high-tech fishing boat deemed the Investor was seen on fire in Craig, Alaska. When officials went to the boat and put out the fire, they found 8 people dead inside, but it wasn't because of the fire. They had all been shot. This is Alaska's worst massacre. Hello, friend, and welcome to High Time Crime. My name's Joel, and on here I specialize in true crime and also glitching out. Hello. Nice to meet you. But anyway, today we're going over a very twisted case that unfortunately has yet to be solved, which is very bizarre given the circumstances. In 1982, a 28-year-old man named Mark Dees Colthurst was rising up pretty high in the Pacific Northwest fishing world. He was considered to be an ambitious and smart businessman who started his fishing journey many years prior when he was just a teen. Mark went from fishing commercially as a teenager to then gill netting to purse seining in 1976, and by the late 1970s, he had co-founded a very profitable salmon venture. So much so, by 1981, he had obtained enough to invest into a brand new $750,000 to $850,000 58-foot purse seine fishing vessel that was built by Rosemma Boat Works. This boat was designed for commercial salmon fishing. It was equipped with a 20-ton refrigeration system for storing fish, a 400-horsepower diesel engine, and a steel hull. This was considered to be a state-of-the-art boat, and it had a lot of room for people to live in it. But Mark was a very hard worker and planned to retire by the age of 50. He was constantly pursuing partnerships and side ventures, and he told everyone that he planned to sail into his own retirement aboard the Investor. Mark, before the Investor, was living in Blaine, Washington, and this is primarily where his operations were. This is also where he met a woman the same age named Irene K. Hudson, and they hit it off great. They met in high school. These two would go on to get married and then have a daughter named Kimberly, who was born in 1977, and then in 1978, these two would have their second child, a boy named John. Now, Irene was a great mother and supported her husband and children with everything she had, while Mark was a great father who did the same for his wife and children. In the year 1982, or 1981, Mark decided that he was going to plan for the 1982 salmon season several months in advance, and he knew that he needed to hire a good crew. Before doing that, though, Mark, his wife, and children all moved on to the boat. Irene originally used to do crewmate work, but she stopped to take care of their children full-time. Mark wanted this. But this family would move from Blaine, Washington to southeast Alaska in about the spring of 1982. Once again, Mark needed a good crew, and so at first he hired 4 guys. A 19-year-old named Dean Moon. Dean fished with Mark in both 1980 and 1981, and so they were familiar. A 19-year-old named Michael Stewart, who was actually Mark's cousin. 17-year-old Chris Heyman, who was the son of Don Heyman, one of Mark's friends, and a 44-year-old named Leroy Fleming. By August, though, a few months after most of these guys got hired, Leroy would either get fired or leave on his own accord. This was mostly because he was getting tired of working around small children. Also, probably because of Leroy's age gap compared to everyone else, and so after Leroy left, another guy named Jerome Keown, who was 19 years old, took his place. Now, with 4 competent crew members, Mark and his family felt great. They felt like this upcoming season was going to be awesome. By late summer of 1982, and only a few weeks left into the season, Mark still had a $30,000 fishing sale waiting for him, and this was considered to be a really good payoff. Let's specifically go to the afternoon of Friday, September 3rd of that year. This day, Mark and crew had sold a ton of salmon, which equated to about $30,000 or so in Petersburg, Alaska. At the time, the Alaska Fisheries Management Rule had briefly halted fishing, and so rather than moving on and continuing to fish, Mark, his family, and crew decided to tie up in a port in Craig, Alaska. Because of that rule, there were about 150 other seiner-type vessels also docked up. Craig, Alaska is a very small area, and at the time there were close to 800 residents that lived in the area. So I'm not sure what happened on September 4th, but September 5th or Sunday was actually Mark's 28th birthday. Him, his wife, and kids all went ashore to a local restaurant called Ruth Ann's, and the crew tagged along as well. Witnesses there claimed they were all jolly and happy and laughing all night. Mark had to borrow $100 to pay for the meal from one of the guys because he didn't bring cash, but he was obviously going to pay him back. So by about 9:30 p.m. on that day, this entire family and crew would leave the restaurant to go back and board their boat. In order to do so, they had to walk across two other boat decks because they were tied together. The port was crowded once again. These boats were the Defiant and the Decade, and the people on those boats all remember seeing the family and crew crossing to get to the Investor. By 10 p.m., the family and crew would be back on the boat, though I did read some of the crew members stayed back in the port for some more drinks. But the majority of these people were in the boat, and them crossing over would be the last time any of them were seen alive. On Monday, September 6th, the morning came, and at around 6:30 a.m. is when a deckhand who was on the Decade noted that the Investor, who was originally tied to the Decade, had started to drift away from the dock with its engine off. But this wasn't super strange because the deckhand and other crew members on the Decade stated that there was someone who they assumed was Mark that was in the driver's seat steering, and that this man even waved back to them. By about 7:30 a.m., the Investor was 1 mile or so offshore at Fish Egg Island, and they were anchored in deep water, sitting completely still. Townsfolk and other fishermen had seen the boat all day, and at the time, they were allowed to fish, so people who observed the boat were confused. The next day, on Tuesday, September 7th, by about 4 to 4:30 p.m., many people started to notice a huge cloud of black smoke and fire coming from the Investor. So a boat called the Casino, which was another seiner, rushed out in the midday to see what was happening or why there was a fire. This is when they saw a small skiff that was headed back to shore, and this skiff belonged to the Investor. In fact, whoever was driving it was the same guy who waved to members of the Decade. But this guy was a young white guy with a thin build who wore dark clothing and a baseball cap. He was around 150-ish pounds and had a pock-marked face. He passed the Casino and waved and told them that he was returning to town to get some help and that everyone on the boat was safe. This man would proceed to go to Craig's Harbor area and then dock the skiff. Multiple people, even including the mayor of Craig at the time, Lee Axemaker, said that he saw this guy come up in the skiff, talk to a few people, make a phone call, and then leave. After this, at least from what we have now, he was never seen again. The crew of the Casino, though, decided to call in the fire to local police, and eventually them, state troopers, and the Coast Guard would go to the scene of the burning Investor, and what they found was absolutely sickening. After extinguishing the flames that would completely destroy this boat, they would find both Mark and Irene dead, who were shot multiple times in the head. Not only this, but they also found both of their children and all 4 of the crew members. Their bodies were so badly burned that it was hard to identify them and also see if they had been shot, but they definitely were. Whoever this man was, somehow between Sunday night or September 5th into Monday or September 6th, shot and killed all 8 people on the Investor without anyone hearing it or noticing. Now, mind you, the Investor was tied up right next to the Decade, which is, if you ask me, quite suspicious. These people were murdered with 22 caliber ammunition. It was most likely a pistol. And so if this boat was docked literally next to the other one, the people in the other boat would have heard it. Even if a silencer was used, a silencer isn't always a full-blown silencer. Somehow, not a single person heard anything. Another thing is that whoever killed all of these people at first attempted to sink the boat by opening its valves in the deep water, but they failed to do so, and so they decided to light the entire boat on fire. The police immediately began a huge investigation. Within days, they had interviewed tons of people, and they posted a $15,000 reward on a wanted poster with a sketch of the person who was seen driving the skiff. After a bit, one person that was accused became the prime suspect of this entire investigation, and that was 24-year-old John Kenneth Peel. He was from Bellingham, Washington, and at one point in time, he worked on one of Mark's boats. The year prior, in 1981, Mark fired John because he had alcohol and drug problems. John would then start working on an older boat titled the Lily 8. A few months later, some of Mark's crew members quit. I believe this is referring to Leroy, and when this happened, John attempted to rejoin Mark's crew. Mark, however, refused. John had also previously dated Mark's younger sister, Laurie, and so there was another immediate connection to Mark. It's speculated that John was resentful of him, and by 1984, 2 years after these 8 people were brutally murdered, the investigators began to hone in on John. On September 10th of that year, they arrested him in Bellingham, and while they didn't have any complete evidence, they did have 4 eyewitnesses in Craig who said that John's photo matched the person who was driving the skiff. John fit the profile perfectly, and in his police interviews, he claimed he was innocent. He stated that he was on another boat in Washington on the night of the murders, but regardless, the police weren't buying it. So about 3 weeks after his initial arrest, he was extradited to Alaska. Eventually, this trial would come, and there was no gun ever recovered, and John stated he had an alibi. He said he spent the nights of September 5th to the 6th with his girlfriend in Washington, and her mother was able to corroborate this. Something weird to note here is that John wore a ski mask during the trial to hide his face. Another thing is that 2 men who identified John as being the guy on the skiff were unable to identify him in court, and this hurt the case. I don't know if the ski mask was the cause, but probably not. After several weeks of deliberation in John's case, the jury ended up declaring themselves deadlocked, and by April of 1986, the judge declared a mistrial because of the hung jury. After this mistrial, John went back to waiting because it was clear a second trial was to take place. During the summer of 1988, this case was retried, and many of the same witnesses were brought back, and after 3 months of testimony and 4 days of jury deliberation, John was found not guilty on all counts. By July of 1988, he was acquitted of all charges, and his legal team quickly decided to sue. By 1997, John was rewarded about $1.2 million or so to cover all of his legal expenses and damages done. Nowadays, John Peel lives a quiet life, but many people, including Mark's sister Laurie, who met him many years later, and a detective on the case, believe that John was the right guy and that he knows more than he said, even if he wasn't the exact person to pull the trigger. Some other theories is that it was a fellow fisherman or crew that decided to take out the investor because they knew Mark just sold $30,000 worth of salmon and knew that he would collect the payment Monday morning. But if he was going to collect the payment in the morning, why would they kill him before? Another theory is that it could have been someone on the Decade or the boat that the investor was tied to. Considering the fact that whoever untied the investor left neatly coiled lines, and the fact that the Decade was directly next to the investor when 8 people were murdered, it's a bit strange, isn't it? Once again, gunshots are loud. How on earth would you, being directly next to the boat, not be able to hear it? It's speculated that each person was shot multiple times. Some of their bodies were so badly charred it was a bit hard to tell. So that would be at least 16 shots between each person. And you want to tell me that no one heard it? Right. Another theory is that it could have been a robbery because of the fact that Mark was going to sell the salmon, or already did, and someone who knew that had reached out to people to do this. This, however, would require someone to know exactly what Mark was doing and when. And so let's theoretically say it was John. Well, if John lived in Washington and Mark and his family and crew were about 2,300 miles away in Alaska, John would have to know exactly when they would be in Craig and exactly what was going on with Mark's business. Not only this, but John would have to drive 2,300 miles to get to Alaska and 2,300 miles back just to commit this heinous crime. This is a 45-hour drive back and forth, and while I'm not saying it's not possible, it just seems a bit bizarre. John would have to, once again, basically know all about what Mark was doing and know exactly where he would be. That sort of seems a bit unlikely. It was 1982. I mean, phones were available, but still. And just because it's unlikely, though, doesn't mean it's not probable. I don't know what happened. Perhaps it was a robbery gone wrong, but nothing was reported as stolen, mostly due to the fire. So as of now, nobody knows exactly, and the police stopped looking into the case in the 1980s for some reason. I don't know what exactly happened those days, but what I do know is that it was absolutely sickening. 8 people were brutally murdered for zero reason whatsoever, and 2 of them being children. Another thing to note here is that Mark's wife, Irene, was also pregnant. How many months along she was isn't stated, but that's another thing to think about. This case is just tragic, and it hasn't been solved, and it may never be. Hopefully, it does, though. It's been literally 43 years since this happened, and all of these people would be much older now, living their lives. John Colthurst was 4 years old and was described as being lively and charming and comfortable in the fishing environment, and a sweet little boy. Kimberly Colthurst was 5 years old and described as being bright and playful. She was a preschooler at the time, but enjoyed the boat life with her family. Irene K. Hudson Colthurst was 28 years old, and before getting married, she would work on Mark's boats. She loved Mark, and they were together since high school. Irene was a supportive and adaptable person and wanted to have a great family and didn't mind living on the boat with Mark and the kids. She was resilient and wanting to grow as a person and family, and she valued keeping things together. Irene loved family events, she loved fishing, and everything the boat life had to offer. Mark Colthurst was 28 years old, and since a teenager, he was deeply passionate about commercial fishing. There's a long story there, but his dad was involved, and Mark really did work his butt off and super hard to get to where he was. I mean, by 28 years old, he was able to afford an almost $1 million boat. That really says something. I do believe his father was also an investor in the boat as well, but still very impressive. Mark was ambitious to grow and building his fishing empire, and he wanted to retire by 50, and he definitely would have. He loved the fishing life, but he knew if he kept going, he'd make even greater money and have the best life for him and his family. Mark had no idea that just hours after celebrating his 28th birthday with his family and friends, that all of them would be brutally murdered. Dean Moon was 19 years old and a standout athlete at Blaine High School. He excelled in wrestling, where he got second in the county and third in the district and third in regionals. Dean was also great at football, where he played the halfback position. His nickname in wrestling was the Champion. Dean had a huge passion for fishing. He worked for Mark from 1980 to 1982, 1982 being his third year. Dean was described as being beyond his years. He was mature, reliable, and a popular guy who was athletic and sociable. He had a playful side and a great sense of humor. In high school, he was given the title of Most Far Out. Jerome Keown was 19 years old and a college student at the time, but also working on the boat to help get some money and also adventure. Jerome was good friends with Dean, and they connected very well. After work, they'd relax together and drink or just socialize. Jerome was easygoing and a loyal guy who was adaptable. He joined the Investor after being on another boat, and that job ended up being a dud. In high school, he played football all 4 years, baseball all 4 years. He wrestled in 9th grade. He was the class president in 9th grade and 12th grade. He was a class representative in 11th grade. He was on the ski club from 9th to 12th grade. He was in the media club for 9th grade. He was in the Honor Society, the 3-year torch. He was homecoming royalty his 9th grade year. He was leather nun 10th to 12th grade years, and he was the boys' state delegate. Jerome would have been somebody. Well, he was, but he would have been even greater. Michael Stewart was 19 years old and a Washington State University student who was passionate about academics and great grades. Michael was heavily involved in music. He was in a fraternity, Tau Kappa Epsilon. He loved sports and weightlifting and working out with his buddy Chris Heyman on The Investor. Fishing was a summer job for Michael to help him fund his tuition, but he liked it because it was a bit of a challenge. Michael was an outgoing, driven, and high-achieving kind of guy. He managed to balance school, a social life, and work. Michael was also Mark's cousin, and he had a lot of enthusiasm for life. Chris Heyman was 17 years old and would have turned 18 on September 7th, or the day their bodies were found. He was raised at his family's marina in California, and from the age of 5, he just loved boats and doing any task he could, such as painting the boat's hulls. Chris enjoyed lifting weights and building hot rods as well, and he loved the California sunshine. Chris graduated Redwood High School in June of 1982, and he planned to study business at the College of Marin because he wanted to eventually run his family's marina. Going fishing on The Investor was supposed to be a 10-week adventure for him. Chris was an easygoing kind of guy with a never-say-die type of attitude. He was enthusiastic, hardworking, and was said to have never lost his temper. Chris's family was very close with the Colthursts, and they even shared 1981 Thanksgiving together. Mark knew he could trust Chris to help him. Rest in peace to all 8 people that died on this tragic day. I hope that they are all resting peacefully and that one day closure can finally come.